Our next speaker is Jennifer Thieme. She is the Regional Monitoring Coordinator for the Monarch Joint Venture. Jennifer, if you'd like to share your screen and begin your presentation.
Hi, Leslie, thanks. Let me pull up our screen here, get that shared out to you. Yeah, glad to join you here today and be a part of this conference that's going on today. I want to introduce myself. I'm Jennifer Thieme, the Regional Monitoring Coordinator at the Monarch Joint Venture. I work on monitoring projects for the Monarch Joint Venture, primarily throughout the Midwest, and we have other staff who work on some other projects across the broader region. But I'm here today to talk to you about the monarch butterfly, conservation, and citizen science. And I'll focus really on one citizen science program or community science program that we're invested in as of late. And we work with IMMP on in the last couple of years. So the Monarch Joint Venture, if you haven't heard of it, it's the partnership organization that includes over 85 partners and fosters communications around conservation of monarchs and their migration. The strength of that is that these partners are incredibly diverse. We've got partners on kind of a more local end of the spectrum who can work with people on the ground who write in their community in small groups like that. We also have partners who work more on a national scale, like federal partners like the U.S. Forest Service and the U.S. Geologic Survey. So it's great to have that diversity of partnerships, great to have that diversity in expertise as well. Well, I'll start with a little bit of information about the monarch butterfly. I know that I'm going to get followed up here with a presentation from Leslie that'll detail about this, but just to give you a little information about the monarch butterfly, the scientific name is Danaus plexus, and it evolved in North America. It migrates between North and South America. I'll show you a little bit more about that in a sec, or excuse me, North and Central America. You can see the map of where it occurs here, and it's on both sides of the Atlantic and the Pacific there. You can see most of the populations in North and Central America. They evolved in North America, but occasionally actually flew off course or got blown off course and would cross the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. Their host plant that the caterpillars feed on, which I'll talk about in a sec, it didn't exist across the Atlantic and Pacific until people started intentionally and unintentionally moving around that genus of plants as they crossed these oceans. And so those butterflies that got carried off course couldn't actually establish breeding populations until around the mid-1800s. So you'll see some numbers on this slide that correspond to the years approximately when those monarch populations could become established, because when they got blown off course, there was actually their host plant there at that time. I drew a little dotted line in there. You'll see that across the Rocky Mountain area. Because in North America and Central America, we kind of talk about two populations of monarchs. There's the eastern and western population of monarchs. And so west of the Rockies, those monarchs overwinter. They migrate to the coast of California and spend the winters there, and then disperse more broadly throughout the western US and southern Southwest Canada throughout the breeding season. And then east of the Rockies, the migration goes down to central Mexico for the overwintering, and then successively breeds further and further northward. So I'm going to focus a little more on the eastern population today, tell you a little bit more about them, and some work going on to learn more about them. Just a brief intro, because I'm going to talk about this for our monitoring efforts. The monarch undergoes a complete metamorphosis. So their life cycle goes through 4 different stages. You'll see here a picture of an egg, and then that hatches and turns into the caterpillar or the larvae, which sheds its skin a few times, goes through a couple of its own phases. And then that turns into the pupa or the chrysalis there on the bottom right. And then the 4th and final stage is the adult monarch, shown on the bottom left. That whole transformation takes about a month to complete. And critical to all those components of the life cycle is one genus of plant or one group of plants called the milkweed plants. And so shown there in the middle is an example of one species of milkweed plant called common milkweed, or Asclepias syriaca. The eastern population also goes through that massive migration I alluded to earlier. So in the briefest of senses here, the monarchs migrate south in the fall, and they spend the winters, that adult that migrated all the way down from its breeding grounds to the overwintering grounds in central Mexico. That's one individual who spends its life overwintering, migrating, then overwintering. And then that same individual will migrate northward in the spring. They'll reach about the southern southeast US, so about where you are, where they'll stop. They'll find milkweed plants that are emerging and lay their eggs there. And that will produce what we call generation one, the first generation of monarchs for that calendar year. So they lay their eggs, reproduce, and that first generation continues that journey northward, expanding throughout the rest of the breeding region. So that cycle repeats itself throughout the calendar year. What do monarchs need throughout that cycle? The overwintering habitat is very critical. When they're down in central Mexico, they primarily roost in a particular species of tree called the IMMP fir tree that occurs at high altitudes in a mountain range in the states of Michoacan and states of Mexico. And they spend about 6 months or so there overwintering. And then also critical to that life cycle is milkweed that we talked about. This is the only grouping of plants that monarchs will lay their eggs on, and it also the only one that their larvae will eat. And throughout that entire life cycle, they're also very dependent on nectar resources. That adult it needs nectar resources to fuel up and to get through its adult lifespan throughout the entire season there, all 4 seasons. So it's incredibly important to have nectar resources available throughout their migration, throughout their breeding, and even on their overwintering grounds as well. Might have lost my share there, sorry about that. Now their population has been declining. This is a graph of the overwintering population as they're counted each winter since about the mid-90s. The best estimate of our monarch population comes from these surveys that are conducted during that period. That's when they're easiest to count. They're clustered together in a few areas rather than dispersed across the entire continent, like you saw their entire breeding range covered. So each year surveyors in Mexico will estimate the area of that IMMP fir forest that's covered in monarchs. So rather than counting individual monarchs, which would be pretty much impossible, they count that area that it covers. So we know how that area changes over the, from year to year. So from this figure, you can see the eastern monarch population has experienced drastic declines in the last couple decades here. And see there's a lot of variation as well from the populations from year to year. And that can be because they're significantly influenced by weather conditions as well. But overall, there's a downward trend since the late 1990s. And the Western population has experienced similar or even more severe population declines in recent years. So one of the largest factors contributing to the decline of monarchs, especially in the late 1900s, was the loss of overwintering habitat. That's really prevalent. It's becoming less prevalent because of some really wonderful conservation efforts logging, illegal logging has subsided to a large degree. Large areas have been protected. Another major factor in the decline of monarch population loss is their loss of breeding habitat. So up in North America, specifically the loss of milkweed plants. Here's an image of some milkweed that was growing in a crop row. And with the advent of herbicide-tolerant crops, we are actually seeing the loss of a huge number of milkweed stems, so huge potential breeding habitat has been lost within those agricultural areas because they are not herbicide-tolerant. The crops are, but the milkweed are not. So we lost all the stems that used to grow up within those crop rows. Some other major factors are the direct impacts from insecticides and pesticides. There's also loss due to vehicular collisions. They do have natural predators, so the larvae get predated on by other invertebrates, so spiders, stink bugs, ants, a whole variety of insects will eat those monarch larvae. And they're also in jeopardy in some areas because of an expanding protozoa called the Ophrysistis electroscura. It's a disease that gets spread among the monarch population. So with that declining trend, there's been established a tri-national goal. And so the US, Mexico, and Canada had leadership who met around 2014 to talk about this issue and set some goals about, how can we sustain this population and prevent it from becoming severely imperiled to the point where it's so small it can no longer sustain itself or sustain that migration. Based on a lot of research from the monarch research community, the goal has been set at 6 hectares of overwintering monarchs. So looking to achieve that 6 hectares of overwintering monarchs for the long term, not just hitting it once every now and then. We have hit it recently, I think 2 years ago, and we're looking to maintain that over time. They have also been petitioned for protection under the Endangered Species Act. That was in 2014, so it's taken several years for the Fish and Wildlife Service to gather information about the monarch and its breeding status and conservation efforts that are going into to help the monarch. And that decision will be released in this December. It won't be a decision of yes, they're listed, no, they're not, but rather it's going to be a decision of they warrant being listed or they don't warrant being listed. So if they do warrant being listed, there will be another process to get some more input and decide what those final rules will be about protecting it. There's also a national goal of adding 1.3 billion more milkweed stems on the ground. And so that's been calculated to be about what we would need to support the more or less doubling of our current population of monarchs. So we've been in the past decade or so hovering around 3 hectares of overwintering monarchs. We're looking to about double that to 6 for the long term. And that would require about 1.3 billion more milkweed stems on the ground. There's some key land use types to this as well, and I'm bringing this up because it relates to the monitoring effort I want to focus on here. Monarchs don't just use parks and preserves and gardens. Monarchs use a whole variety of habitats, which makes them so interesting. They can use what we call here unclassified grasslands, so that just might be an unmanaged field, somebody's backyard or a vacant lot somewhere. They can use developed open space, so urban parks or those rain gardens maybe in an urban area. Agriculture, like we mentioned, there used to be milkweed in agricultural crop rows, but also there are edges around the perimeter of all of these agricultural areas, and those are potential habitats. There are, of course, protected grasslands, so you're probably thinking of some beautiful parks you visit in the spring and summer where you see monarchs. And there's rights of way, so lots of potential there for monarchs to reproduce and nectar on rights of ways. So it's really important for us to get information for understanding monarchs and how their population will, excuse me, how their populations will be changing in the future, especially based on, you know, the conservation efforts that are going on, how we're managing our habitat. Data can contribute to a whole variety of things. There are population models that use data about monarchs and their habitat. There are a lot of goals being set. Like I mentioned, the 1.3 additional stems of milkweed goals. Want to evaluate habitat quality, maybe refine our best management practices, learn more about climate change and track diseases. So all kinds of cool stuff that we can do with good quality data. There are lots of citizen science programs out there, community science programs out there to collect information on monarchs. I'm going to highlight two real quick to show you what we can do with that and also what's still missing. Journey North is a really cool program that allows people to log onto their computer and basically enter when they see a monarch or a monarch egg. When they see milkweed emerge, they really focus on the first sighting in the spring to track that migration, and also sightings in the fall, again, migration tracking. So they did some research with their community source data and found that in the northern regions, monarchs were more likely during migration to roost in conifer trees and maple trees. And then when they got a little further south, they were more likely to use oak and pecan. There's another cool program called the Monarch Larvae Monitoring Project that has collected information on monarchs that people have collected in the wild and then reared indoors, and then submitted as survival information and their parasite information to the program. This Monarch Larvae Monitoring Project looked at the actual parasites that parasitized and killed the monarch larvae that were getting reared, and had some really cool findings. They found that about 17% of the older larvae were parasitized. They found 7 species of parasites, including 3 that had never been recorded in monarchs before. So that's just a glimpse of the really cool stuff that we can do when people not only care about monarchs, but contribute data to these types of programs. There's still some stuff missing. We have a lot of information from high quality sites. People often go to their parks to collect information, but we don't know a lot about unconserved spaces. We've also got a lot of information from population centers, but what's going on in the more rural areas where there's not a lot of people that just happen to be available to collect information. We have records of where and when people see monarchs, but are missing the context. So what was the habitat like, or what was that monarch doing? So there's a lot of data gaps to fill. The Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program was designed to fill those data gaps. This is a program that's been evolving for about the last 4 years now, that's put together by a group called Monarch Conservation Science Partnership. It's a group of monarch researchers and biologists who took a look at the data we have from those existing programs, like the one I talked about, Journey North, and their roosting data, Monarch Larvae Monitoring Project, and their survival data, and said, what are the gaps? And how can we fill those gaps without reinventing the wheel? How can we build on what's already there? So they're looking for something that's spatially balanced. The Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program is a way to collect information on monarchs and their habitat in a spatially balanced way. So you'll see some red squares here. Basically, there were randomly assigned 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer cells put all across the breeding range where we want to focus our efforts. And that's just to give us some spatial balance and avoid that bias of just surveying near population centers. It also covers those five land use sectors that we talked about earlier. We need to know more about what's going on in different land uses that are used by monarchs. Basically, get a more representative sample of the habitat. This is a program, the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program, also focuses on monarchs and their habitat. So we're getting at that context of not just when you saw a monarch or where you saw a monarch, but what was the context there? What was the habitat like? So I'll focus here on some priority for us is the random sites, those 10-kilometer and 10 by 10-kilometer blocks. I'm focusing here on Arkansas where those blocks are. You can find this map on the monarchjointventure.org website. There's a programs drop-down menu. We're under the science program, and you can find more out about this program. So this is the distribution of those randomly assigned areas, focal areas. And within each of these blocks are specific points that we'd like to monitor. So we can share those points with you if you're interested. You can reach out to Leslie Cooper, you can reach out to myself if you're interested in learning more about where those specific points are. And we're aiming to survey a diversity of land use types within those blocks. You can also choose your own site. So maybe you can't get out to one of those randomly selected sites, or you have a particular place that's important to you in mind. You're maybe doing some restoration on in your backyard. As long as you've got a space that's at least 1 acre in size, you can use this program to monitor it as well. This is what we call a self-selected site. It's basically a non-random site. So it's weighted a little bit less mathematically because it's kind of got that self-selected bias to it. So we do really encourage people to get out to those randomly selected sites if you can. And we'll provide guidance and assistance to help you access those if you need be. But certainly, if you've got important self-selected sites to do, you can do this as well. When you're conducting the Integrated Monarch Monitoring Program, it's contributing to more than just a national data set that's maybe pie in the sky and not well connected to you. In fact, it's well connected to the Arkansas Monarch and Pollinator Conservation Plan as well. That plan has specified some information that they would like to collect within the state. There's some goals related to restoring and enhancing 500,000 public acres. And so this is a good way to help track what's going on those acres. Within that plan, there are specific goals about quantifying milkweed and nectar availability. So the IMMP can help us quantify milkweed and nectar availability. They're also interested in breeding hotspots and migration corridors. So looking at where those monarchs are breeding and where they're migrating through, we can get that information through this program and through the surveys from it. The IMMP requires a little bit of prior knowledge, just an understanding of what it's like to be outside for a while. It's very helpful. You can also get trainings online. We like a lot of programs right now, haven't been doing in-person trainings, but all our trainings are available online. And we hope next year to have some protocols in place where we can have small group trainings. So a little background knowledge in what it's like to be outside and walk through a prairie off the trail is really helpful, because this is something that occurs not just on a trail, but you're actually walking through the prairie generally. The frequency is weekly to monthly, depending on what you do. And you could be out there for maybe a half hour, 45 minutes, up to a couple hours, again, depending on what you do. There's a lot of cool pieces to this program. There's 4 optional activities, so you can pick and choose what works for you. We have a milkweed and blooming plants survey, which we recommend doing monthly. That might take you 1 to 4 hours, depending on how many milkweed and blooming plants you have on your site. That could keep you really busy or go really fast. There's an egg and larvae survey we recommend doing weekly. An adult survey we recommend every 2 weeks, and a survival and parasitism survey. So that would occur about, it would have daily care if you're rearing a monarch. Just to point out that these are designed to be compatible with the existing programs. So while you're building this data set, you're also building other research programs data set, because the data that we collect through this is basically the same and can feed right into their data sets and be analyzed on a broader scale. Activity 1, we call it Activity 1, the Milkweed and Blooming Plant Survey. It takes about an hour to maybe up to 4 hours. And it involves putting a transect up and down your site. So let's say you have a site that's big and open and looks like this. We have a defined area that's about 2.5 acres. We like to set up a square or a rectangle on your site. And then basically just walk up and down that area in a specific way, putting down these rectangular, what we call subplots, every 5 meters. And so every 5 meters you stop, you put down a little rectangular frame and you record the milkweed that you see in there and the blooming plants you see in there. So good walking exercise. The other optional activity we call activity 2, the egg and larvae survey. That we recommend doing weekly, and these are just recommendations. If you can't get somewhere every single week, that's totally fine. But that would involve finding milkweed on your sampling plot and looking at the milkweed for eggs and larvae. And you would try to record every 2 weeks. Might take you a half an hour, 45 minutes to walk the perimeter of your site. So again, we're always surveying this 2.5 acre area. It could be as small as 1 acre if you have a small personal site that you're monitoring, but really you'll be walking the perimeter of that, looking for adult monarchs within a certain distance of you. And these trainings with more specifics are online. Fourth optional activity is to study survival and parasitism. So if you have milkweed and monarchs on your site, you could collect an older larvae, collect what we call a 5th instar. It's like the almost ready to pupate. You'll find an older larvae which has had several days or up to a week or two to process its entire lifespan on your property, and bring that inside, rear it, see if it survives, and maybe do if it's parasitized, and you can submit that parasite to the Monarch Larvae Monitoring Project, where they will actually identify what that parasite was and contribute to that data set. We had been having in-person trainings. We still have that box on our website. If you go to monarchjointventure.org under the science program, you'll find the IMMP. Click on in-person training and there's a button you can say I'm interested in the IMMP training. That at least lets us know where geographically there's hotspots of interest, and that's where we'll try to set up in-person trainings, or we'll work with a local facilitator to set them up. There's local leadership and support we can connect you with. There's also online training, which I highly recommend. You can do this on your own and reach out to us at the MJV if you have questions, or Leslie Cooper where you are. Quick glance at the participation from 2018. We had about a third being citizen scientists. Another third or so were local or regional conservation staff. We had several people from academia and some people from the state and federal governments participating in this program. We did a survey at the end of that year. 88% of them said thumbs up, they'd like to do it again next year. It takes us a few months to process each year's data and results. So by the time we were a few months after 2019, we were in the middle of a pandemic. So we're still kind of pulling together some data analysis that got delayed because of COVID this year. Real quick run through of what type of things that you can get from this information. I'm going to highlight Ohio data from 2018. We had a great showing, great participation in the program in 2018 that in Ohio, so we were able to take a look at the most frequent blooming plants. So this is type of information that you can collect at your state level if you can, when you have more participation. They had a lot of white clover on their sites, common yarrow, Queen Anne's lace, black-eyed Susan, common dandelion. So some pretty common flowers, kind of early successional stuff that can come up in areas right away, or most common on their sites. They also found an average of about 1,300 stems per acre of common milkweed on the sites that were surveyed. There's research going on using this protocol, so any data you collect are very useful. Just a real quick look at some information, some research projects out of the Monarch Joint Venture by Laura Lukens and colleagues, taking a look at how milkweed seeding compares to the actual establishment, so what grows on site. Finding that it may be more or less useful to plant certain milkweed plants because some of them show up all the time, whether you seed them or not. They were finding that with common milkweed that was on pretty much every site, whether they seeded it or not. And on the other end of the spectrum, seeding Asclepias verticillata, the world milkweed, on no sites where it was seeded did it actually grow. So something to think about, some information we can get using these type of data. I think I'm running short on time. I'll skip right to the opportunity to build your skills. Like I mentioned, we've got trainings online, but more than that, we've got informational presentations online. So if you want to learn more about monarch biology and conservation, we got that training right there for you. Want to learn about monarch identification? There's some insects out there that look like adult monarchs. There's some caterpillars that look like larval monarchs. So you can learn how to tell those apart, as well as learn how to identify some milkweeds. So I hope you leave today inspired to share more of your valuable observations with the research community. So being involved in this way can not only advance our collective knowledge of monarch and their habitats, but it's an opportunity for participants to engage with new people, learn about the study species, and really inspire others through your knowledge and action. So thank you very much for your time here.
Thank you, Jennifer. What a great talk. Let's see, I did have one question that someone asked. So of the 4 activities that you mentioned in IMMP, do you have to choose all of them, or can you just choose one, or how often do you have to go?
Great question. You can choose just one if you'd like. So as long as you get out to your site and map it, that's what we want, is we want to make sure we know physically where your site is, then choose any one of those activities. You can start with the one that's most fun for you or most exciting, and see if you want to take on more after that. If you're not sure which one to choose, we'd recommend doing the milkweed and blooming plant survey. It's the least frequent one, so it's like time once a month to get out. It gets us some great information on habitat, and that's where we're really lacking information on what's the habitat like, especially in these random areas. So if you're not sure what to choose, we'd love to encourage you to do the milkweed and blooming plant survey.
Awesome. Thank you, Jennifer. I'll give it just one more minute to see if we have any last-minute questions trickle in. Let's see. Jennifer, can you adopt an IMMP site as a team?
Yes, that's a great way to do it. If you have a person or a couple people to partner up with, or you want to reach out to us and see if we can help you connect with someone in the area, splitting that up is really helpful. Whether you split it up by activity and I do the milkweed stuff and someone else looks for eggs and larvae, or you can go out with a team member just so that it makes it a little faster or more efficient for you.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining us.